Alright, so for this demo, I want to look at how we can create a login functionality in PHP where the username and the password is being stored in a database. Alright, now I'm doing this from localhost on my local computer or my personal computer. Um, if you were putting this on an actual web server, then the same PHP code can be used. One other thing is that when storing a user's password in your database, it is recommended that you hash that particular password. Even if it's to use one level of hashing, or you can hash and then encrypt or whichever version of it. I won't be hashing the password though. I will probably just do that in another video, but for this one, I just want to show how we can create a simple login functionality with some basic PHP code and log in a user depending on whether or not their username and password is in the database. So I have this pre-built test application that I'm using. So let me just run it quickly. All right, so this is what it will look like. If I enter a username and any password right now, it should log me in. All right, it has some session within this application. So it grabs the username and pass it here using a session variable. All right, if we go over, the session is being maintained. So that's what is being done so far. Now, the plan is to log in a user only if the username and the password is in the database. So I'm going to start off by creating the database and creating the table in the database. All right, so I have my XAMPP control panel running. I want to go to PHP My Admin, so I'm just going to click the admin next to where I have my SQL module running, and that should take me to PHP My Admin. All right, so now that we are within PHP My Admin, which some persons should know that PHP My Admin is a database management system. It was created using PHP and it does allow us to create MySQL or MariaDB databases. Right, so I'm going to create a database now for our little application. So I'm going to click on new, and I could have written the SQL commands to create the database and create a table, but that's a video or a lesson for some other time. All right, so I'm going to call my database test db. I'm going to leave the UTF-8 encoding as the one that is here by default. All right, this one is pretty simple and straightforward, so we can leave that. Click on create, and the database was created here. Now we need to create a table to store the username and password. So I'm going to call this users. I want 3 columns, one for an ID, one for the username, and one for the password. So I'm going to bring that to 3 columns, click on create. This will create the table for us. All right, so I'm going to have an ID column. I'm going to make this ID column auto increment. I'm going to use it as my primary key. All right. Next, I want a column called u name for username. I'm going to change the data type for this to varchar and set the length to 255. Next, I want a column for my password. I'm going to call it passcode, and then I'm going to set the data type to varchar, set the length to 255. I'm calling it passcode. I could have used password, but it will be picked up in my PHP script as a keyword, but it could still, password could still use, but I'm just sticking to passcode just because I didn't want to use password in the PHP script. Alright, so we need to remember the name of this column and this column because we're going to need those again in our PHP script. Alright, so I'm going to save this table. Alright, so before moving on from this part of things, alright, what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert username and passcode or password for at least one user. So I'm going to do that now. Click on my insert tab here. Alright, so for the username, I'm going to type jwill, and for the passcode, I'm going to do a bcd1234. Alright, and then we can save those data or that record. So I'm going to click on go. Alright, so if I should browse, alright, so the username is here, the password is here. Alright, again, remember I had mentioned that typically, or for security reasons, you would want to hash your password, but as I said, we're just working on getting the login functionality to work first, and then in another video I'll talk about hashing our password for storage purposes in our database. Alright, so back to my PHP file, and again, the sample application I have here, it is what is giving me this particular application running on my local server. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add the necessary code that is needed. I can provide you the code that I type, just for those persons who would want to, watch the video and maybe have the code so they can use it. Alright, so as I go, I'll try my best as well to explain the code that I'm using. Right, so persons can be clear on what is being done, where to use it, and all of that. Right? So the first thing I'm going to do is to create a connection to the database that we just created. So I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to call it con. I'm going to set this equal to new my SQLi. So what I'm doing here, I'm using this MySQLi function to connect to a database. All right. So if I over the MySQLi function here, VS Code is telling us that it represents a connection between PHP and a MySQL database. So that's the purpose of this function, to create a connection to um, a MySQL database. And this is me using the object-oriented style of creating that connection, hence the new keyword here. All right. Typically, persons should recognize, well, if you did any form of object-oriented programming, you should recognize the new from when you are creating objects in object-oriented programming. Right? Now, when establishing the connection to a database, we need to specify the host or the server to which we had placed the database. So I'm using my local computer, my quote unquote local server. So for that reason, I'm going to type local host. Right? So this is telling us where we can find the database. Right? Next, I need to specify the username for the connection to where the database is, or the username for where the PHP MyAdmin application can be found. All right, so by default, I didn't change anything in terms of username and password. So the default username will be root. Here you're getting a little breakdown of what should go within the parentheses of the MySQLi function. So first it's the host name, then the username, then the password, then the database name. We can specify the port as well and any socket. But for us, I'll just be stating the host name, the username, the password, and the database name. Right. So as I said, the username for us is root, right? And that is by default, unless you go in and change that username. Next, we will need our password, and I did not set any password. It is running on localhost, so it is more or less secure. I don't have to worry about any hackers or anything like that. If you are putting this on an actual server though, or a live server, then chances are, you would want to create a password to connect to your database. But for me, it will be left as null, right? Because there's no password by default. And then the final thing I'm going to place within this parentheses is the name of my database. And if you can recall, we created this database here and we're calling it testdb. So that's the name I'm going to place here. So it's testdb. All right. What I'm going to do as well is to do a little error handling just in case we cannot connect to the database, an error message will be returned. So I'm going to say or die. So I'm using the die function here to display any error that might cause us not to connect to the database. So I'm going to specify within the parentheses of the die function, I'm going to specify this con variable because it is storing the connection to the database. So I'm going to say con, and I'm going to use my arrow operator, and then we're looking for any connection error. All right, so that's it basically. All right, so after establishing the connection by stating the host name, the username, the password, database name, I'm just using the die function here to assist me with a little bit of error handling. All right, so we close that off with our semicolon. Oh, I need to put the database name in quotation as well. All right, so let me do that. All right, we're good to go now. All right, what I can do is I can actually go and refresh here. All right, so the reason why I refresh is just to test if an error message would have been displayed based on the connection here that we set up. So if I change the database name, for example, to test FB, right, and there was no database in our PHP MyAdmin called test FB, I should now get the error message. Right, so we got the error message because of an unknown database, test FB. So this proves to me that the connection between our PHP script and the database is working. So all is left for us to do now is to log in the users, or at least pull the username and password from the database to log in the user. So I'm going to change this back to testdb and then just refresh. So our connection is up and running. All right. All right. So next, I'm going to add some PHP code to my application so we can start the process of logging in the user. Right. I have some things here in terms of error messages, testing if the username and password was entered. So what that is, if I click on, well, I would have to, let me just show you quickly. Right, so if I comment this out quickly, comment out the connection. All right. Right, so if I click on login, right, so I just want to show you what this is doing, right? What this bit of code here is doing. I just want to show you what that is doing. Let me just refresh. All right, so this is what it does. All right, let me just refresh again. All right, so if I click the login without entering a username, this message will be displayed. Without entering a password, this message will be displayed. So that is what this bit of code here is doing. Right, so we're not interested in this part of it, right? That is already set just in case the user don't enter any username or password. So I'm not interested in that part, right? Now I have another if statement here that is checking to see if the username and password fields, if they are not empty, then this should occur. It should move the user to another page called welcome.php. Now what we want to do is to add code to this section where the only way it will take us to welcome.php is if the username and password is in the database. Right? So for that reason, I am going to now add some code here. I'll be using what we call prepared statements in PHP, and prepared statements are good as a countermeasure to SQL injections, right? We want to do other things as well to ensure the security of our application, but using prepared statements is one way of assisting with making your PHP applications a little bit more secure as well. So as I go, you'll see where the prepared statements are being used. Right, so I'm going to first create a variable to store the user's name, and this is coming in from the field, text field here for the username, and I'd call that text field name as well. So I'm going to say name equal post, and then I'm going to pass the name of the text field here, and as I said, I was calling it name. All right, and I'm going to do the same thing for the password. So I'm going to create a variable called password, set that equal to post, and I am calling the password field, I'm calling the password field password. Right? And where these values are coming from is from our form. Right, so the name for the password field is password, and the name for the username input text field, it's name. So that those are what we are using here. Right. Right, so next I want to write some SQL command, or at least I want to write an SQL command. Now we're trying to get the username and the password from the database. And you know that whenever you're running a query against a database to return a particular record or sets of records or set of rows, then we would use our select command or our select SQL command. So I'm going to create a variable called SQL. I'm going to set this equal to my actual SQL command now. So I'm going to make this SQL command a select command. All right, so understand enough basic SQL commands are very useful. And I want to select all from the table called users. And remember, we had created that table over here. All right, so this is our users table with the username and the password. So I want to select all from users, and this should be done where the uname is equal to something. All right, so this is where I start to use the prepared statement. So this question mark here represents a placeholder or a dummy value for a prepared statement. All right, so I'm going to say where username is equal to some value and passcode is also equal to some value. Now remember, from the users table, there's a column called uname and there's a column called passcode. So we have a column called uname and a column called passcode. Right, so that's what we need to put inside our select command. All right, so we can close this out. Now, another part of using prepared statement is that we need to prepare the statement, bind the statement, and then execute the statement. All right. So this represents our statement that we want to prepare. So this is our statement template or our SQL template. So the next thing we're going to do now is to prepare this statement for future execution. So I'm going to create a variable called statement or stmt I'm going to set this equal to the connection that we created. So it was being stored in con. All right, we can find that connection here. So this is the variable I'm using. All right, I'm going to use my arrow operator here to now go ahead and prepare the statement that we created. All right, so all I'm going to do now is pass this variable inside the function of our prepared statement, or within the parentheses or the um, parameter of our prepare function. All right, so if I hover over this, VS Code is telling us that the prepare function it is used to prepare an SQL statement for execution. So we're now preparing this select statement here for future execution. Now, after that is done, we now need to bind these values to the actual values. Now, what will be the actual values is what we're getting from the username field and the password field. Right, so we need to bind those values now. So again, using the stmt variable along with my arrow operator, I'm going to say bind param. Right, so if I hover over that function, it says that it binds variables to a prepared statement as parameters. All right, now the username and the password, they are both string type. Right, because when I was creating the table, I had created the username and I had set the data type to varchar. Also for the password or the passcode, I set it to varchar as well. And varchar, those are, well, varchar is a string type. Right, so I need to specify here that the two values, the username and password, they are string. So I need to open a set of quotation. So the first value is a string, the second value is a string. And then I need to tell where those values are coming from. They will be stored in these variables, right? The first one will be in the name variable, or coming from the name variable. And then the other is the password variable. All right, so this allows us to bind actual values to our temporary values. So what it will do is it will then transfer whatever is being stored in the name variable, it will transfer it here, and whatever is being stored in the password variable, it will be transferred here, right? Now, once the binding is done, the next thing that we need to do is to execute our statement. And for that, we use the execute function, right? So execute, we don't need to pass any values to the execute function. And if I hover over the execute function, it tells us that it executes a prepared statement. All right, now once that is done, I am now required to store whatever results we are getting based on this SQL command. I need to store it somewhere. Right, so I'm going to store it in a variable called result. All right, and I'm going to set that equal to the prepared statement, or the statement is tmt. Again, with my arrow function, I'm going to access, well, my arrow operator, I should say. I'm going to access a function called get result. All right, so now what the get result does is that it gets a result set from a prepared statement as a MySQLi result object. So it gets a result based on our prepared statement here, right? And it will be storing it in my variable called result. Right, so I'm not finished with the result variable just yet. I'm going to create another variable. I'm going to call it row. I'm going to set this row equal to the result variable. Right, now remember the result variable already contain some values that will be returned to us based on this get result function. So I'm going to use my arrow operator, and then I'm going to use a function called fetch assoc, and this will fetch the results for us as an associative array, or fetch the records or rows as and store it as an associative array. So if I hover over this, it tells us that the fetch assoc function, it fetched the next row of a result set as an associative array. So it will, so let's say there were 10 usernames and passwords within the database. It will just go through each row of the table within the database and store them here. Once it finds one that matches, then that will allow us to log the user in. All right. All right. So we now need to create an if statement that will use the results that were fetched from the table within the database to now go ahead and log the user in. All right. So we need to create an if statement to assist us with that part. All right. So we say if result arrow operator. All right, after the arrow operator, I'm going to use the num rows, which exists as sort of a variable within PHP. And what it does is that it returns the rows from a particular result set. Right? Now, it is seen as an integer variable, and I'm going to set this equal to 1. So if it did find a result or find a match from the result set that was returned, and we set that equal to 1, so it is basically saying to us, the one here is basically saying to us that yes, it is true, we found something that match. Right, so if we indeed found a matching username and password, we want to send the user to this place here, which is the welcome.php. Right, so you place this within that if statement. else there's no match, let's just echo incorrect credentials. All right, let me just make it a little bit bigger. So put it in probably an H1. All right, so that should be fine. All the session here is doing is record the username, store it in a session. So once the user log in, the username will be recorded and used across pages to show that that's the user that is logged into the particular session. Right? That's all this thing here is doing. And once we are finished with the prepared statement and we are finished pulling data from our database, or we are finished with the database connection, it is advised that we close the prepared statement. All right, and we want to as well close the connection to our database. All right, so we can now go ahead and test our application to see if it is logging in users based on what is stored in the database. So I'm going to do a quick refresh here. All right, it is saying undefined variable line 49, which is this. All right, so I don't think that there was an error. I think because I had tested the application before just to show you what would happen if you don't enter a username and password. So I didn't reload it. So I think that was causing the problem. So we can do a refresh and everything seems to be fine. All right. So but I can try just to see. So if I click the login without entering any username or password, all right, so it's still giving me the errors. I need to figure that out quickly. All right, so I think what I'll do is I'll move this closing of the statement to inside the if, because if you notice inside the if is where we actually had used it. So it wouldn't be recognized outside. So I'm going to place it inside the if, and that should solve the problem. All right, so if I click login, right, without entering any username or password, then we will get this error message for the username and this one for the password. Let's type in a username and a password that is not in the database. So as a reminder, the username in the database is jwill and the password is abcd1234. Here I'm going to type temp and abc123, click login, and it says incorrect credentials. We could maybe style this so it looks a little bit better, but it is saying incorrect credentials because what we entered is not in the database. Now, if I should type jwill, which is in the database, and ABCD1234, which is in the database, and click login, then it logs the user in. So in summary, that is just a simple login functionality that you can create in PHP by connecting your PHP to your MySQL database. Right. So as I said, I provide you with the code. You can always, rewatch the video, pause where you need to pause, but I'll provide you with the code snippets, so you can add that to your application. Right. So that is basically it for this demonstration.